Good morning. I'm Mackenzie Guinan with Executive Mosaic. For over 20 years, Executive Mosaic has been the leader in connecting, promoting, and branding executives of consequence in the GovCon community through our exclusive peer networking events and media properties. GovCon Wire is where we host our virtual webinars like the one you're attending today, while the Potomac Officers Club is in-person summits on the Potomac Officers Club within the Executive Mosaic content box on the platform. I'm excited to let you know that as a live attendee of this event, you'll receive a 15% discount code to our upcoming 2026 Army Summit that's taking place on June 18th. This is for all live attendees, and the code will be sent to you in an email after today's webinar. The code is only available for a limited time, so make sure you take advantage of it when you see it. I now want to welcome and thank you for joining us for The Federal Market Has Changed. Has your strategy webinar, and thank you to our platinum sponsor, Chertoff Group, for sponsoring and leading this event. We are extremely grateful for your partnership. As always, I would like to go over some quick housekeeping items before we get started with the main event. Our speaker bios and other helpful resources can be found in the toolbar at the top of your screen. And during the event, if you have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A box. And now to get things started, I would like to welcome Aaron Roth, Principal and Head of Federal Strategy at the Chertoff Group. Aaron, over to you.
Thank you, Mackenzie. I appreciate it. And good morning to everyone. Thank you for joining. Just briefly, before I let Emily and Greg introduce themselves, I wanted to introduce myself and give you a little bit of context for this webinar as we dive in. And just a little about me. I spent 30 years in the federal government, primarily in Homeland Security, and I've been at the Chertoff Group now for several years in the private sector. It's been a big learning experience for me over the past 6 years, and I look forward to, having the conversation with Emily and Greg and sharing a little bit of information that we can to help you all. And just quickly as a scene setter, I think one of the things as we look at the environment and how much change has occurred is you sometimes need to step back from it all and sort of think about the context for which, the United States finds itself today. And first and foremost, and I think this, will inform a lot of how we talk about the changes that we're seeing, is that we find ourselves, and I've been in this national security business for a long time, and I feel like every year people say the same thing, is that we're living in a more complex environment than ever before. And so I'm going to say that again, in the sense that we find ourselves in a near peer competitive environment again. We still have all the asymmetric threats that have plagued us over the past, 2 decades, between terrorism, criminal networks, cybersecurity concerns. And so all of that has sort of culminated into a place where the United States needs to rethink itself relative to mission. And that really trickles down not only in the Department of War and the intelligence community and law enforcement, but across all agencies. And we'll get into some of that as we go forward. But when you think about the time we find ourselves in, with China and cybersecurity, supply chain concerns, energy security, all the things that we're dealing with as a nation, it really informs how we think about what the buying behavior today looks like. And so I'm going to start from the point of, and I think after everyone sort of suffered through Doge, if you will, over the past year, the reality is the federal government is open for business. It's not shrinking. There's a lot of spending. We've seen structural changes. We've seen priorities shift. But the reality is there's a lot of money pouring into the federal government, and there's a lot of desire to spend money rapidly in this environment to address that context that I mentioned up front. And so then the question is, well, what really has changed? And I think as we go through the conversation today, what you'll see is a lot of what has changed is the buying behavior of the federal government, and they want to get things faster. They want to move towards mission outcomes, and they want to see accountability in the process a little bit, more so than maybe we've seen in the past. And as you hear from Emily and Greg, they'll give you their perspectives. I think, Emily will give you the sense of she's seen a lot over the several decades that she was in government, and that a lot of this is cyclical, and we see some patterns of the past sort of reemerging today. And then I think from Greg's perspective, coming out of the Department of War, and then also thinking about, technology and where that's leading us in terms of buying behavior and mission outcomes, should be informative for you all. So look forward to the conversation. let me allow Emily and Greg to introduce themselves. Emily, please go first.
Hi, I'm Emily Murphy. I am the CEO of Government Procurement Strategies and a senior fellow at the Baroni Center at George Mason University. I spent 16 years in the federal government, including my last 4 as the administrator of the General Services Administration. Also worked, though, at GSA during the Bush administration, at the Small Business Administration, for the House Small Business Committee and the House Armed Services Committee. Spent the rest of my time in the private sector, and I'm a recovering government contracts lawyer. Excited to talk to you today.
Awesome. Thanks, Emily. Greg?
All right, well, since Emily opened that door, I'm a recovering economics major from Bates College. I think somewhat useful in thinking about procurement. I think everything I learned in college, the federal government taught me the exact opposite. But I've been with the Department of War for about 14 years as government, wide variety of roles, ranging from back office, ERP implementations, to analytics and AI, and then kind of ending at the CDAO and DOW, working on the CJADC2 portfolio, command, joint all-domain command and control. Been with Palantir now 3 years, loved it, working on very exciting use cases, whether that's providing and attempting to provide some thought leadership in the procurement space, but more importantly, working with different teams within government and here at Palantir and our other ecosystem partners on delivering really incredible technology to make sure that our warfighters have the best capability available to them. And really excited for this discussion today, and thanks to the Chertoff Group for setting it up.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Emily and Greg. Let me dive into some of the questions. And again, as Mackenzie mentioned up front, if you do have Q&A, please enter them in and we'll try to get to them as we go through the conversation. But Emily, let me start with you. You know, when you think about all the changes we've seen over the past year in terms of priorities, acquisition, sort of the regulatory landscape around acquisition, what comes to mind for you for contractors that are trying to position in this environment, given that sort of upfront scene setting that I did? What are the types of things that they should be thinking about from your perspective?
So I think it's incredibly important right now to be aware of 2 shifting realities. Actually, probably 3 shifting realities, but the people. I mean, we saw the deferred resignation program last year. We saw a lot of the acquisition workforce left government. So the contracts that everyone is anxious to get awarded, there are fewer people to do it. So it means that contracting shops have to be looking for processes that speed things along. At the same time, though, we've got a policy shift. So we've had not just executive orders on government contracting, some statutory changes on government contracting. We had the revolutionary FAR overhaul that led to 52 deviations to the FAR. And then even just in the last 4 months, we've seen those deviations, about a quarter of them have been updated. So those have changed again. Then you've got the policies behind them and the implementing guidance. So we've got a workforce that's already stretched thin that is now trying to implement a new set of rules. And so as contractors, one of the things we can do to help them is by understanding that and helping them find that path to the area of least resistance. Give it as another example. Within my old agency, the General Services Administration, they just initiated a new reorganization of the Federal Acquisition Service as of May 1st. And they took all of their indefinite delivery vehicles, the GSA schedules, their GWACs, like Alliant and Polaris and VETS, and then their other IDIQ vehicles like Oasis, and they put them into one organization to try and streamline how they were going to go through those. And that should take some pressure off, but it also means that everyone's trying to figure out what they're doing again. And in the Assisted Acquisition Service, which, if you remember, does the majority of its work supporting the Department of War and the Department of Homeland Security, they've got a goal of doubling the amount of work that they do by the end of the administration. But they've got about a third fewer employees to do it. So they're trying very hard to be business friendly and get things done and deliver for customers. But they've got a lot of changes, and and we then have new executive orders that have come in and instituted reviews on anything that's not a firm fixed price contract or that's not commercial. And that's slowing things down again. So to the extent that contractors can be thinking through how to help them figure out how to make something commercial, how to make it firm fixed price, how to come up with alternative acquisition pathways, how to be responsive and understand and anticipate their needs. I think that's what I'm really advising companies to be looking for right now.
That's great, Emily. And a lot of what you mentioned at the tail end there on the commercial side, we're going to come back to in just a little bit. So I'm glad you teed that up. Mm-hmm. And so, Greg, let me pivot over to you. And I should say, for the audience, we recognize there's a conversation that's sort of national security oriented, Department of War, and some of the things that are going on there. But then also many of you have interest across the entire, federal civilian agency community. So we're trying to thread these things together a little bit, but there are nuances, obviously. So, Greg, Palantir's, I think everybody probably knows, kind of the cool kid right now. And so when you think about, the changes that have gone on in the Department of War and buying behavior, the structural changes with the PAEs, what are you seeing in terms of changes and how to position on those changes and what success looks like for contractors?
Yeah, I think this is the first time I've ever been called a cool kid, so I guess I picked the right company at the right time. So I appreciate that, Aaron. I actually watched the Secretary Hegseth acquisition transformation speech again yesterday, and I think there were some really interesting takeaways there. The most interesting one to me was how he framed the problem, and it was actually very much from a Donald Rumsfeld speech on September 10th, 2001, and in essence, his point was, hey, the United States has many adversaries. We know who they are. I think they're more peer adversaries than near peer adversaries, Aaron, like China, Russia, what we're seeing with Iran, North Korea. Rogue actors are going to become more prevalent with AI. But he said one of our largest adversaries to national security is the acquisition process and the PBB process, the Soviet era style process and dictatorship that almost occurs and runs the Pentagon. And I think it was an important distinction. While the people that run the acquisition process in the Pentagon, many of them worked with, are incredible humans, extremely talented, some of the best in the world, it was a recognition that that process has to change if we want to always stay ahead of our adversaries, especially adversaries who in a lot of ways make us look like David and their Goliath, with China being able to outproduce us in many of the important aspects of national security. And I think we all recognize, too, that this idea of acquisition transformation is not new. It's been talked about for decades. I think, though, we're starting to see some real momentum here, because I think the United States and national security community is seeing that the world has fundamentally shifted, with different conflicts occurring as we speak in the world today. And I think we're starting to move into some interesting trends. We're starting to not buy effort and compliance. We're starting to get into buying outcomes, and that is the big focus. We're starting to look at the right incentive package. We're starting to be able to look at a sense of urgency with that wartime footing. And I think, to your point, we're moving away from this kind of program by program management and more into portfolio management, making sure that we have the right set of capabilities that can close a kill chain or close a cash chain and so on. And so the one thing I want to articulate real quick before I go into the PAEs is, I don't think people realize the mindset problem of just having a compliance process-oriented acquisition system. And I think if you look at that consequence, it affected us in two ways. One is, if you look at the existing defense industrial base, especially with the primes, in a lot of ways, because of this compliance process-oriented system, these primes are in essence legal and financial firms that also build munitions and airplanes. We want to shift that, where main focus is the outcome, and compliance and finance are secondary. The second part is that it's really made new entrants hard to get into, because it is very arduous to be able to get into the process and figure it out with all of the rules, things like cost accounting and so on. And so I think the PAEs are really chartered and have the authority and accountability, the portfolio acquisition executives, to actually start tackling this. I think they're tackling it in three major ways. One is, their real main job is to provide speed and scale to the department, to be able to get capabilities at the need of the warfighter. We've all heard President Xi ready to be able to invade Taiwan 2027. You see what's happening in Russia. You see what's happening in the Middle East. You see what's happening in South America. Speed and scale matter. China still has mass compared to us. And so what we've learned in Russia, Ukraine, what we've learned in the Iran war is that quantity still matters. And so how are they getting about this? One is requirements, going, as Emily said, much more outcome-based requirements. How do you actually do requirements that encourage manufacturability? How do you make sure that you're not being overly prescriptive or overly exquisite in what those capabilities are to meet the particular mission threads and kill chains? The second is incentives. How do you have multi-year contracts so there's a sense of demand and consistent demand for these primes as well as their suppliers? How do you provide the right firm fixed price outcome-based contracts so as they become more efficient, these companies get better margins? And then also, how do you hold them accountable? How do you have penalties on missed deliveries? It is important, while the DOGE, people might agree or disagree with it, it is important to hold these companies accountable and kill some of these programs to be able to free up resources to new entrants or companies that are winning. The other thing is oversight. We're seeing in the Army right now and the Navy, them using data and having dashboards that are actually showing the different capabilities, how those are relating to mission threats, and how those are performing. And the acquisition executives actually managing based off of data on a weekly basis, which we're excited to see. The other thing we're seeing in the portfolios is this sort of reduction in budget line items, so providing more flexibility. So how do you start working with Congress to be able to have, instead of 4 or 5 PE or 10 PE lines that represent each program, how do you have a PE program element line or a budget line just for a capability so you can offer that flexibility throughout? And then another last part of the speed and scale is a deregulation. Huge effort by OMB and GSA and others and NASA and DOW on making the FAR less burdensome, corresponding DFARs, FMR. That has helped quite a bit with new entrants coming in. Cost accounting is being looked at now. The second piece I would say that is being looked at is how do we get new entrants on board? If you're looking at what the Navy Rapid Capability Office is doing, they're going on a road shows to places like New York and Austin and Silicon Valley, talking to private equity, talking to private capital, talking to new entrants, making it easier to get through their front door. I think the deregulation is helping that quite a bit. I think firm fixed price is helping with the opportunity of the more margin that they can make, the more valuable the company is, which makes private capital more attractive. And then I think there's been interesting sources and like economic defense units, really interesting. Office of Strategic Capital, their ability to be able to do loan programs is really fascinating. And I would say the last one and a really important one is just the workforce. I think, getting on this wartime footing and this sense of urgency where, I think GAO just did a study that most major acquisition defense programs are about 11 years before they get to deployment. That needs to be shrunk to like 1 year or less. And I think this sense of urgency and this wartime footing is a really important mindset, knowing that time and speed are as advantageous as mass, as advantageous as our military experience. And so we're seeing some interesting changes there. All that to say is I'm actually pretty bullish. I think a lot of stuff was started well under the Biden administration. A lot of stuff is being accelerated here. And I think it's trends that are bipartisan. And so I'm very bullish on how the industry and government are starting to behave towards national security. That was great, Greg. And I think you teed up like 15 topics for follow-on webinars while you were going through that. That was awesome. I'm going to pull on some of those threads as we go through this as well. Before we do that, just quickly, and this is just to make sure the audience isn't asleep. So like if I had an eraser or something, I would throw it at everybody to make sure you aren't sleeping. But just a quick poll, and it's kind of a just vitals check with everybody. If you don't mind answering that poll, just so we can get a sense of things and decide what to focus on as we go forward here, that'd be great. So I'll give you a couple minutes there. I think everyone's asleep. All right. We'll go on to the next topic. Just quickly, I wanted to, there's some of the results there, if everybody can see those. We're going to get to that civilian agency exposure. That's great. Thanks for answering those. All right. So just quickly, a couple threads I wanted to pull on
it really gets at this point, and there's kind of three areas of focus in my mind. Is may have to go back one there. Whoever's running slides. Here we go. So on the topic of speed and agility, and then, the firm fixed price direction, I just wanted to sort of put that there and then talk about it through the lens of, with you, Emily, and you think about a lot of the changes in some of the civilian agencies and how hard they've been hit. And this is interesting to me because you've got priorities that have shifted in this administration, meaning, national security is obviously getting a lot of the dollars. There are some other agencies that have, undergone significant budget pressure. But the reality is we're also in an environment where kind of everybody's at war, so to speak, in the sense that, Greg's point about 2027 and being prepared for conflict, which means all these other federal agencies need to be able to do what it is from a policy perspective they've been asked to do with fewer resources, but at the same time, make sure they're not vulnerable relative to the larger government ecosystem. So when you think about, how things have evolved on the civilian side, and even in the questionnaire, we saw a lot of folks have been hit hard there and they have to pivot. What kind of things come to mind for you? First, what are you seeing in terms of buying signals from some of the larger Fed Civ organizations? Some are doing very well, some aren't, versus how to be more competitive in that environment or think about diversification into other areas. So I know I threw a lot at you there, but what are your thoughts around those topics relative to Fed Civ?
The first signal that the administration sends publicly as to where they want dollars to go in fiscal 27. And then how Congress responds to that lets you sort of know how the negotiation is going to happen. But tracking that, because when you look at that, it's clear, for example, Coast Guard is definitely a priority for the administration. So looking within the DHS agencies, in the past, everyone's focused a lot on ICE, CBP. They're still important. I don't want to suggest that they're not, but looking into Coast Guard and other agencies as well. Looking at GSA, every month they do a forecast meeting for their assisted acquisition service, and they're now starting to do them for the Office of Centralized Acquisition Services that tells you what they've got in their pipeline and what's coming. So being very aware of those signals that the administration's putting out there to help you guide where you're going to be focusing on it. But nothing takes the place of sort of that the customer intimacy, talking to your clients, knowing where they want to go, engaging with them in any format you can, and then helping them shape that acquisition strategy, responding to RFIs, showing them where there is a path of least resistance to get things done, because they're facing the same problems everyone else is. We've got a late appropriations result each year. We haven't had appropriations hit on time for all of the CFO Act agencies since I think 2005. So late is now the new normal. But that means that you've got a lot of acquisition you're trying to get done in a compressed time frame. And now you're trying to do it with fewer employees, with changing regulations, and in the midst of implementing new tools. You're seeing GSAs working to put in some new acquisition systems. You're seeing agencies across the board trying to leverage AI to do this better, all of which I think is going to be very positive long-term, but does mean that this year, the more you can be the partner to those agencies and help them through it, the better off you are. And the more you can be involved in helping them discover it. The other thing I'd say is, as you're positioning, don't position as we're the company that's always done this. There's a desire to do things in a different way there's a desire to shift that perspective on it to be really focused on how you're going to deliver results in a budget-friendly, conscious manner that's going to relieve burden from them, and that isn't going to. There seems to be a sense in some parts of government leadership that contractors are only there to embed themselves further. If you're an integrator or a consultant or someone along those lines, it really needs to take that focus back to performance-based and what the path, the cycle is for getting this accomplished, and when you're done, and then or what the next steps would be after that. So making sure that that's obvious also as you're talking about it, that they're not looking at this as a 20-year obligation. Right now, they're really trying to focus on what they can get done in the next 1 to 3 years.
That's great, Emily. There's a couple of themes I'll come back to with what you were going through there. And I know I keep saying that, but there's more and more topics that are raised that I want to highlight. Greg, just quickly shifting over to sort of Department of War, national security space. You mentioned speed and velocity. And when you think about the PAE organization, if I'm a contractor, how do I think about engaging? What does that look like? You mentioned new entrants. What if I'm not a new entrant? How do I engage in that environment? What does success look like for me, or what are you all seeing that success looks like?
Yeah, I think Emily hit it really well. I mean, as I'm just trying to think of my government experience, and by sitting on a large budget, you get the honor of getting to hang out with a lot of vendors, whether it's at conferences or them coming into your office. And it was a crazy percentage. It was something like, because I tried to calculate this over a year just to see it, but like 80% of those vendors would come into my office. And I'm convinced they didn't even know my name or what office that I actually belonged to, but they were selling me on something on data or AI or cloud or edge compute. And it was almost like what they were selling was this general purpose commodity and never tailored the narrative and story to the problems that we had or the capabilities that were required or to the operators that wanted them. And there are so many opportunities to be able to work with different operators, whether these are different experiments or exercises. The Army just had a jailbreak exercise where they invited vendors on contract, not on contract, to come down and actually operate and be able to help integrate a bunch of their C2 capabilities, command and control. There's so many conferences, so many information on the website. I think there's this value-based conversation that is actually surprisingly easy to have, but often doesn't happen that effectively. I think if you can do that effectively, there's so many opportunities and so much money within the department, right? I mean, as Emily kind of articulated, there's actually a good amount of money with reconciliation, with funding. Year is getting smaller. If you look at the $1.5 trillion budget that might go into effect in 27, huge opportunities where I think there's this idea of going from pilot and not pilot that then leads to nothing or 9 years later. But we're seeing pilots go from 0 to 3 months and then getting operationally put into the field and then actually scaling from there. I actually think it's the wrong way to go on terms of like price reduction. Like I think competing on price is the wrong way to go. I think it always should be this value-based approach of if you can solve a problem, whether that's solving for delivery times or you're solving for additive manufacturing and contested logistics, or you're shortening the kill chain or helping with joint fires, or you're helping automate auditing or procurement. I think there's a huge need for those type of automation capabilities. I think on the consulting point that Emily brought up, I think this has been a really hard transition. I think AI in a lot of ways is eating consultants and system integrators lunch in the most traditional sense. I mean, McKinsey, for example, got an award from OpenAI for consuming 100 billion tokens, which is about 32 million PowerPoint decks. I think, I actually think this stuff actually empowers government people to be their own consultants because they actually know more than the consultants do. I do think there's an opportunity for the consultants and system integrators to pivot to more performance-based, to be leveraging these commercial technologies and AI and their domain expertise, that they have deep domain expertise to be able to build these type of outcomes. I think what is struggling with is that means they're going to reduce their revenue most likely, but it will increase their margins. And I think they need to get used to this new procedure. And so in some respects, I'm extremely bearish on the consultants and system integrators. As Emily pointed out, they are pretty much staff auging in bed. I think most government people with these new tools can do what they can do. But I do think there's immense opportunity to fundamentally shift that business. And we're pretty excited to see where that goes and to participate in that journey.
That's great, Greg. I want to ask you both just quickly, when you step back as a contractor and you think about doing business with the federal government, Greg, you mentioned in your former job having a number of vendors come in and just, give their spiel on what it is that they were trying to offer you, may have not been exactly oriented on the problems that you were dealing with. I'm sure, Emily, you've seen that many times. How should contractors think about, positioning themselves to have the right kind of conversations to shape the government opportunities? A lot of this sounds so obvious, but, in my time out, one of the big lessons that I've learned from being on the government side and then the industry side is it is literally two ships passing in the night. Very rarely does the government speak well to industry and industry understand what the problems are inside of government. So in trying to bridge that gap, what is a contractor supposed to do? How should they be thinking about sort of the quick recipe card, if you will, about what does successful shaping look like? And I'll start with you, Emily.
So it's interesting. I never felt we were very shy about sharing our problems when I was in government. It's a great thing about transparency. Not only were we going out and talking about it, but we had inspector generals who were more than happy to point out where our problem areas were. We had GAO who would tell us all the places where we still had room for improvement. I think it isn't the catchphrase "progress made," it's improvement still possible. So you'd have hearings on the Hill, you'd have legislation that would be pointing to where they saw a problem. You'd have our own budget documentation and our justifications and our requests and things which would tell you where we acknowledged we had a problem. Yet a lot of times I would have companies come in to meet with me who didn't seem to have any idea what our mission was, what our strategic plan was, what would set out as our goals, what we were trying to accomplish, and what our pain points were. So to the extent that customers are really focusing on what it is that an agency is trying to get done, especially leadership in a federal agency, the political appointees, the average tenure is 18 months. No, everyone wants to leave having accomplished something. The career employees are incredibly mission driven. So they're looking for someone who's going to help them execute on that mission. The extent you can come in and tell them you understand what it is they're trying to do wins so much goodwill. And it takes the conversation from being one where the government feels that they have to explain to you to one where the government can then problem solve with you.
That's great, Emily. And I'm guessing, Greg, you're going to say ditto probably to what Emily said, but let me get your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I think Emily described it beautifully. That's exactly right. I will say, coming back on this industry side, I'm a big believer in, I think the revolving door has this bad connotation, but I do think you truly don't understand either side until you've lived on both sides. And while I think their government folks are incredible at describing their problems, I think they do it often, whether it's in public or in private, whether those are through the IG or GAO reports or conferences, or even if you just grabbed a cup of coffee. I think that they're wanting to collaborate. I think to Emily's point, the most proud I've ever been in my career is being a government employee. And I think, you always want to do well for the mission, whether that mission is in, agriculture or warfighting. I think, though, if I could go back in time, I think I was relatively ignorant, though, on some acquisition stuff that I wish I'd better understood. I'll give you an example. In government, you have this weird thing, contractors are always trying to screw you, and somehow they're trying to reap profits off of you. And in a lot of ways, I think we don't understand that we need to weaponize capitalism. And maybe as my little economics major coming through here, that is where the incentive is. That's where the innovation occurs, is to make it more efficient. And I wish we as kind of acquisition professionals in government were taught more about financial statements and profits, and not just think about cost reasonableness or only think about competition having to take 12 months to get through an RFP and an RFI, and actually allow for more of these CSOs and OTAs, which I think are happening now, but also understand the economics and the incentive model of these companies, and to be able to encourage those to be able to get the best capability that lives beyond you. What I find with a lot of this innovation stuff is it's very personality driven in government, right? You have a few folks that are willing to kind of do the charge. The reason why I think the incentive and the contract and the acquisition structure matter is if you get that right, that capability and that mindset can live beyond that individual that might be leading this particular effort or that particular initiative. And so probably if I could go back in time, it actually would have been me learning more about how the companies are incentivized and then putting that within the procurement and then modeling that and the behavior to be able to increase the likelihood of both parties being wildly successful.
That's great.
When we talked about firm fixed price several times, to Greg's point, firm fixed price is a great way of changing the incentives and and making sure that the right allocation of risk takes place between the private sector and the government. But it also means you've got to get the requirements right. And that is another area where the more government and industry are talking to each other, the better chance you have of getting the requirements right so that you actually have a successful firm fixed price contract.
Yeah, that's a great point, Emily. When you think about the one complaint that, especially sort of the larger primes, SIs, OEMs would have about government is, the requirement's never the requirement because it's constantly changing, right? Shipbuilding's the perfect example of that. And you see where that's gotten us. So I 100% agree with you that it's on the government in terms of the accountability in a fixed price environment. You got to lock down the requirements and then allow industry to bring, the sort of the pricing information associated with that fixed requirement. That will be challenging, but I also like the simplicity of it in a lot of ways. It sort of simplifies the matter on the government side and frankly, the industry side as well. That's great.
But if you look at it, if you're looking at a 5-year contract cycle, if you're trying to do a contract for technology now for 5 years in the future, it's really hard to know what you're going to be buying in 2031.
Right.
The technology is evolving so quickly. I'm sure Greg could tell us this better than anyone. There's going to be some tension created here also.
Let's stay on this for a second. Yeah, Greg, what are your thoughts on just managing sort of the technology evolution over the course of a 5-year contract under a fixed price environment?
Yeah, I think the outcome model, for example, if you write the requirement correctly, I think a lot of these things can kind of be aligned with that. Like, for example, the ability to be able to speed up procurement, to be able to get the audit of the department. Those are outcomes that I think have flexibility in the right technology that is being used. I think where technology has sort of allowed this to be more accessible to, I think, a lot of the maybe vendors that couldn't access it this is where I was kind of going with the consulting argument, is actually I think there's a lot of ways, if you take a lot of what these consultants are doing, sort of these repetitive tasks, these automation of processes that are just being done through brute force, I think there's a lot of tools now available and accessible to the skill sets that those folks have without having to learn how to code and those type of things that actually allow for this level of automation and this level of kind of productization of that work that actually might decrease costs and increase margins for these companies doing a lot of those type of tasks. And so we're starting to see more of that as we come through. I think we are right in that, this is why we care so much about the commercial technology side. A lot of what we're seeing at Palantir is people are using us almost as GFE, government furnished equipment. A lot of our business, we have a bunch of different consulting firms, a lot of other software companies that are using us as infrastructure and setting up their own businesses. with pretty healthy margins, pretty healthy revenue. And that's what we want to see within the department is how are they being able to reuse these assets that they've purchased to allow other companies to come in, use those assets, speed up their delivery to be able to get the outcome. And it's a win on the reusability, it's a win on the speed, and it allows these other companies to be able to participate without starting from scratch each time, whether that's being able to understand how to get to users or understanding how to get to data or understanding how to get through accreditation of the different networks. And so we're starting to see this play a lot more. I think, this idea of enterprise data and technology and AI, I'd say 4 or 5 years ago, people were scared about it. And now you have, senior leaders saying use as many tokens as you can use without probably knowing exactly what that means. But I think at least people are willing to play with the technology and be able to take a little bit of risk as they're learning about how to best use it.
That's great. Let me, we've sort of alluded to it a couple times, but, the commercial pathways, CSOs, OTAs, SIBRs, on and on. I think I'm assuming most of the folks in the audience probably have experience with some agencies that feel comfortable using those and others that can't even spell them for the most part. And so, there's a bit of a gap. I have seen a lot more, appetite, if you will, in different agencies to explore how to use these vehicles. I think sometimes they have the authority, but maybe not the experience in using them. And so that's part of the challenge in terms of educating contracting officers and whatnot. But can you give me your thoughts on, how should government be using those tools? Obviously, they've been encouraged. We're seeing more activity, but how can we take that further? And then on the industry side of things, how should they be thinking about opportunities relative to those commercial pathways? And Emily, please go.
So this is one of my favorite topics. I love talking about SIBRs and CSOs, probably a little less on OTAs just because GSA didn't have OTA authority, which is one of the challenges that you've got a major tool that's only available to some agencies. And even when they're using it on behalf of agencies that have the authority, they can't use it. But I do think from a government standpoint, right now, government's looking for an easy button, for a faster way to say, here are our requirements. Here's what we need. Show us you can meet that requirement, and then we'll continue to work with you. So prove it to us, and we'll do it at a low dollar, a low cost proof of concept. That usually is what you end up getting with an OTA. It's the first step in getting a commercial solutions opening. And with a SIBR, the phase 1 SIBRs are usually $50,000, $75,000. They're very small. But they give the government a chance to go and get that prototype, demonstrate it. And then as they progress on, it makes for a far faster way of acquiring something in a much more commercial way, longer term. For industry, it also makes a lot of sense because the old paths to getting a work awarded to you were to partner with the right company and just come along on either their socioeconomic status, their contract vehicle, something else. It's not working anymore. We're watching SBA has been restricting new entrants into the 8A program, which includes the Alaska Native corporations. So that door is not as friendly, at least right now, as it has been in the past. The contract vehicles that used to be really great for getting awards, NASA SOUP is delayed in SOUP 6. It's coming. NIH gave up on CIOSP4. It's dead. COSP3 will end next April, so a little less than a year left. So everyone's looking for other ways to do it. From an industry standpoint also, though, it's important to remember that just because you're not a small business doesn't mean the SBIR program isn't worth looking at. We just saw the Department of War do a SIBR-based award to Deloitte because I'm not sure if they acquired it or if they, what else they did, but there are other ways to leverage these in a way that makes sense for both parties. For CSOs, it's a great way of bringing in new types of software and bringing more commercial, non-traditional government contractors in. And so if you're one of those companies, whether you're a traditional defense contractor or a non-traditional defense contractor, I'd really suggest getting much, much more familiar with CSOs and SIVers. One last thing I'll point out is if you look at the House version of the Defense Authorization Bill this year, the Chairman's Mark, it has some additional restrictions around or guidance around how to use OTAs. So, and everyone's been wondering what was going to come. It's asking for further delineation of why are traditional contracts not needed, but it's still saying we want to encourage this because we think it's going to speed things up.
That's great, Emily. Greg, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think two quick thoughts. I mean, I'm a big fan of getting rid of the middlemen type of contracts where like you use a vehicle and then the prime gets 10% and it's like the only way to get through is by using one of these strange vehicles. I think the more you can have a direct relationship with the government, the better. And the more accessible that option is, that's great for the company. I think it's great for the government. And so I think in this, a lot of these programs, their spirit of them are exactly right. And then they get kind of abused as sort of these kind of middleman 10, 15% haircut type of things that I think hurt the government and hurt the corresponding companies. I would say like maybe my take is I you know, we at Palantir use a lot of CSOs and OTAs and that type of stuff. To me, there's a first principle, whether it's a FAR-based or an OTA, of like, do you actually have the right requirements? Do you actually have the right incentives? Do you have the right metrics in place? Do you have the right champion? Is there funding there? Can you get access to users? Is your technology the right problem set to be able to fix it, or your right skill set? And so to some extent, to me, I think you can have really bad CSOs and you can have really great FAR-based contracts. If the first principles are there, that truly to me is the key. I think just having a CSO by itself without meeting those first principles is great maybe in terms of a stat, but not actually achieving the acquisition outcomes in the spirit of what people want to achieve with those type of vehicles. So I always go back to, and again, Emily, you mentioned this too, of just the first principles of good procurement. Know what you're buying, know why you're buying it, know how do you know that you've been successful, and have the right incentive model to be able to encourage accountability if things go wrong, but to make people wildly successful if things go right.
That's great, Greg, and a good sort of foundational piece when you think about this. You can make all the changes in the world, but if the basic foundation isn't there, you can get sideways regardless of pathway.
Yeah, I'll say, I'll come up with a new pathway. Emily, since Emily was GSA, you can tell me if this is, I want to create a cost minus contract. And so, you know, you have the cost plus contract, which is you in essence get paid the cost of a material or labor hour and then make a reasonable profit, let's say like anywhere between like 8 and 15% maybe. And in this sense encourages the worst behavior, right? Because the more you spend, the more profit you get, and the longer it takes, the more you get. It's like the worst of all worst. Now, not everything should be firm fixed price. I mean, if you're building like a carrier or some of these really sophisticated programs that don't really have a commercial market or don't have clear requirements, cost can make sense. But the cost minus concept is like you only get paid if you demonstrate value. And so an example, you know, would be like a cyber bug bounty, right? You only get paid if you find a bug, or if you find a certain, this is kind of controversial, people don't like us to get the right metrics, but if you find $200 million of fraud and the government's able to recoup that, why can't that company get 10 to 20% of that recoupment? Or if you're able to find and clean up the department's books in audit, do you get a percentage of the transactions or invoices that are paid in time, or the transactions that are reconciled correctly? I would love to get more into this cost minus, this more of you get paid as a distribution of the value that you provide. We would love to do that at Palantir. I think there's a lot of companies that would put that skin in the game, knowing that if they can show that value, it's outsized returns for both the government and that corporate interest.
So we
take a little bit of equity in your work. Yeah, go ahead, Emily. Sorry.
Yeah. So there was something called the Share and Savings Contract Program that Congressman Tom Davis passed way back about 20 years ago. And every time we tried to implement it, the budget folks came back in and said it's an Anti-Deficiency Act violation. We can't do this because we can't tell you how much it's going to be. It's the right way to be trying to incentivize things, to actually look at if a company delivers value in a way that saves taxpayers money, that saves agencies money, that delivers value, and it's going to have a set amount of savings, why wouldn't we pay them out of the savings? So whether you call it cost minus or share and savings or whatever else, there, but it requires the appropriations folks to get involved in it and help fix that. And I would love to see that happen.
Yeah, that's great. That's another webinar topic I wrote down that we can come to. Just quickly,
go
I
back
want
to
to leave.
performance based.
That's right.
Like that,
I want to leave.
we've all been agreeing. Sorry.
Right. No. I want to leave room at the end here for some questions if folks have them. But as we wrap up sort of the discussion here, and I'm going to try to pin you down on one thing, which is really hard. But if you had to pick sort of a single way, that a business has to think about what success looks like in this environment, whether it's Fed Civ, whether it's Department of War, whatever may come to mind for you, what kind of things would you mention? What single thing comes to mind as you think about their positioning to win in today's environment? And Emily, I'll go with you.
I think that based on the conversation we've had today, I'd have to say really understanding your customers' requirements, how they want those requirements to be delivered, and making sure that you're aligned and that you can deliver it in the most cost-effective, fastest way possible, and then communicating that. Because frequently you'll find a contractor understands what the government's trying to do, but that understanding gets lost in the words of their proposal. There's so much verbiage in some of those proposals that I read that if you're not clearly able to communicate to the government that you understand what they're trying to accomplish and that you've got the right components to do that, then it doesn't matter how much pre-work you've done. So understanding the requirements and then communicating that understanding.
That's great. Greg?
Yeah, I think Emily hit out the most important theme, which is to be able to show and demonstrate value and to be able to tell that story. I'll hit a flavor of that. At Palantir, our main mantra, and I think which is a basic mantra, is you have to deliver what you said you were going to deliver. And for a long time, as all of you know, Palantir wasn't the cool kid, and probably the only thing that people liked about Palantir is that it could deliver, and probably hated everything else around it. And so, I think this idea of being able to deliver what you said you were going to deliver is the best BD in the world. People want to be able to be part of teams that are winning and adding value. And the way to get more work is to deliver the current work that you're doing. And so, I think sometimes when we go into these briefs, we are good storytellers, we're good at describing the value proposition, but delivery rules everything. And the more we can deliver, the more work that we win. And I think that's always the mantra in life. So that's sort of our going in position.
Awesome. Well, let me take a few minutes here and open things up to questions. I think everyone has a Q&A box. If you have any questions you'd like to tee up, I'm happy to take those, and I'll tee up the discussion here with Greg and Emily. So I'll give you a minute here or so just to tee up any questions you may have. And then if not, I've got a couple other things I can bring up as well. All right, I've got something here. Let me pull the thread a little bit. Emily, I think you alluded to it on just small business set-asides, the larger topic of set-asides. Obviously there's been a lot of change there. Lots of questions, I think, on the industry side of small business and how to think about those relationships and JVs that were so popular over the past few years. What is your thinking around that?
So I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that the House Small Business Committee marked up a bill last week to codify the rule of two for small businesses. They did it with an amendment to that bill so that it exempts task orders. But it's the first time we would see that codified. and going in, as opposed to being a regulatory sort of compromise that was always in Part 19. The fact they felt the need to do so really demonstrates the shifting grounds around small business contracting right now. And if you look at it, actually in 2025, the awards to 8A companies went up substantially. So I think that that's been one of it demonstrates that contractors saw that and government saw it as an easy button, as a fast way to get contracting awarded. But we've now seen SBA come in and say, look, we're going to start auditing and making sure that small businesses are performing the required amount under limitation on subcontracting. These aren't just pass-throughs, that you're not just slapping a small business label on things. And as a result, you're seeing a slowdown in new companies being admitted to the program. We're seeing a reduction in the number of set-asides, maybe not on small business as much or on service-disabled veteran, but you're seeing it in other areas. And so if I was a company right now and was thinking through my strategy around joint ventures or mentor proteges, I wouldn't write them off, but I would be very strategic about where I was looking to do them and make sure I had a very good value case for how I was going to do it, and not lose sight of the fact that a mentor protege agreement is supposed to be first and foremost for providing developmental assistance to the small business. Contracting is only supposed to be a sub-way of doing, a portion of how you deliver that value. It is not supposed to be the primary reason for those mentor protege agreements.
That's great. I've got some questions here, so I'm going to rapid fire these, Emily, Greg. So try to give 20, 30 seconds or less on these so we can get through it. From Scott, do you have any suggestions for a large entity that would like to implement CIBR or CSO? Greg, any thoughts there?
I mean, there's just so many CSO opportunities. Like, I think one area that I would explore if you're on the national security side is this marketplace called TradeWinds. You submit a requirement, you submit a video, it's like 5 minutes, and you can get put on that marketplace. It meets the competition requirements, and it's very effective in being able to get, as clients or customers want to be able to use those vehicles, CSOs, you kind of hit the competition goals there. DIU is another, I think, a great example of how a CSO should operate. Those are the two places I'd probably start first in terms of the national security side.
And Emily?
On the CIBR front, since to do a phase 3 CIBR, you have to be doing something that derives from, extends, or completes work that was done under phase 1 or phase 2. Phase 1 and phase 2 have to be small businesses. So if you're a large entity that wants to do a CIBR, I'd be looking at phase 1 and phase 2s, seeing how you integrate into their technology.
That's great. And from Rich here, so Greg, this was kind of a topic you hit on VARs, resellers, the preference to go direct. Do you think there's value add there? Should their fees be capped? I think, we could probably talk about value add all day long there, but just in terms of fees capped, your thoughts on that?
I mean, we don't have them. I think for a long time, it was just the easier path for a lot of software providers to sell their licenses through these kind of third-party folks. And so it was almost the only or the easiest path to get there, especially a lot of these didn't have federal businesses or infrastructure. For us, going direct is always the easiest, fastest path. I think it's the best deal for the government. It also sets up a direct relationship with the government, and I think it helps with accountability and value. I don't know if there should be a cap or not, but I think the more direct you can do with the actual provider of that capability, the better.
Awesome. Emily?
And I just caution that I think that when you can do work directly with an OEM, that's great. There are so many small software providers out there. The government doesn't have the capability to have a contract with all of them, and there is a large compliance cost to being a government contractor. The administration's trying to do everything it can to reduce that cost, but the OEMs, not all of them are going to want to be government contractors. So if we want to have access to their technologies, there still is a role in there somewhere for VARs or resellers.
Kind of a necessary evil. And then the last one, 20 seconds each. Any shiny objects to think about over the next 2 years? Something that the government may be looking at that the contractors should be thinking about. Greg?
I actually think focusing on the boring stuff is where the most interesting part over the next few years will be. I think a lot of the back office functions that fundamentally are the, in military terms, man, train, and equip portion of the mission. Those maybe traditionally back office functions are just ripe for automation and a different way of thinking in this new world of agentic AI. And I think that's going to be a huge, interesting focus and a lot of potential across the entire federal government.
Awesome. Emily?
I'm going to go with Greg on it's the boring stuff. We've got to get the RFO, all those deviations that were put in place have to become final rules. And then they've got to be implemented into systems, and you've got to train the workforce on them. And how well you do those 3 steps is really going to change what acquisition looks like for the next decade.
Great. So Greg, Emily, thank you very much for being on today. And I want to thank Executive Mosaic as well. Mackenzie, over to you.
Thanks, Aaron, and thanks to Emily and Greg as well for today's webinar discussion. Thank you to all the attendees for the time you spent with us this morning, and we hope to see you at another one of our events soon.